Okay, so ready to dive into the future of energy. We're taking a deep dive today with Future Energy by Alex Raynham. It's a pretty fascinating look at where we are and where we might be going with how we power our world.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how Raynham starts the book, sort of setting this stage, talking about this energy predicament we're in and how it's really woven into every aspect of our lives.
Yeah, it's easy to forget just how much energy we're using every single day, right? Like even just think about making that morning coffee or, getting to work or school or wherever you need to go.
Exactly. And the thing is, a huge chunk of that energy, 87% actually, is still coming from fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Coal, oil, natural gas.
Wow, 87%. That's still a massive amount.
It is. And it's kind of crazy to think about, right? We're burning through these resources that took millions of years to form, like at an incredible rate.
And it's not just that we're using them up so quickly, but the way we're getting them out of the ground is also causing some serious problems.
Oh, absolutely. Raynham gives some pretty stark examples of that. We're talking about dangerous working conditions, pollution, and even fatalities.
Right, like the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. That was a pretty devastating reminder of the risks involved.
Exactly, and all the consequences that come with it for both people and the planet.
And that brings us to the whole issue of climate change, right?
Yeah, burning all those fossil fuels releases massive amounts of CO2, which is driving global warming.
And we're already seeing the impacts of that. Melting glaciers, rising sea levels, extreme weather events.
And it's not affecting everyone equally. Raina makes a good point about this. Richer countries are consuming way more energy and contributing more to the problem, even though they make up a smaller part of the world's population.
So we're basically stuck in this cycle of dependence on fossil fuels, even though we know they're finite and that they're harming the planet. So where do we go from here?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But Raynham's book isn't all doom and gloom. He actually points out that almost half of all the energy we produce is wasted.
Really? Half?
Yeah, it's a pretty staggering statistic. But it also means there's a huge opportunity to become more efficient.
Okay, so that's encouraging, I guess. But what can we actually do about it? I mean, as individuals, it's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed by the scale of the problem.
I get that, but Raynham really stresses that even small changes in our daily lives can make a difference. It starts with just being more aware of how much energy we use and making different choices.
Okay, so like what kinds of choices are we talking about?
Well, for example, we could try walking or cycling more
Yeah.
or taking public transportation.
Right, or even carpooling with a friend or colleague a couple of times a week.
Exactly. And then there are things we can do at home too, like turning off lights when we leave a room, unplugging devices we're not using. Even adjusting the thermostat a few degrees can help.
I think being mindful of how much water we heat is a big one too, like taking shorter showers instead of baths, and only running the dishwasher when it's full.
Absolutely. And recycling is another big one. It takes way less energy to recycle materials than to create them from scratch.
So it all comes down to reducing our reliance on energy-intensive processes. Okay, that makes sense. But what about bigger solutions? Like, what about nuclear power?
Ah, yes, nuclear power. It's always a bit of a controversial topic, isn't it?
Definitely. It seems like there are pros and cons to consider.
For sure, on one hand, it has the potential to generate a lot of energy from a very small amount of fuel.
And it doesn't produce CO2 emissions, right?
Right, so that's a major plus when it comes to climate change.
But then there are the safety concerns, like Chernobyl and Fukushima. Those were pretty scary reminders of what can go wrong.
Absolutely, those were devastating events. And then there's the issue of radioactive waste disposal, which is a challenge we haven't fully figured out yet.
Right, it stays dangerous for thousands of years. That's a long time to worry about.
It is, and Radam acknowledges these concerns. But he also talks about nuclear fusion as a potential alternative. It's still in the experimental stages, but it could be a game changer.
So fusion is something to keep an eye on for the future. But what about more immediate solutions? What about biofuels?
Biofuels are definitely interesting. Raynham discusses things like biogas, which uses bacteria to break down waste and produce methane. And some countries are even using toilet waste to power cars.
Wow, that's pretty innovative.
It is. And then there's bioethanol. Brazil has been using sugarcane waste to make it.
I've heard about that.
It's still a carbon-based fuel, but the plants absorb CO2 as they grow. So it's a more sustainable cycle.
I see. But I've also heard concerns about biofuel production competing with land for food.
That's a valid concern. Ideally, we'd be sourcing biofuels from waste products or algae, which can be grown in areas that aren't suitable for food crops.
So biofuels have potential, but they're not a perfect solution. What about other superfuels that are being developed? I've even heard about cars running on air.
Yeah, that's not as far-fetched as it sounds.
Yeah.
Raynham describes electric cars powered by zinc air batteries. Basically, the zinc reacts with oxygen from the air to produce electricity, and it can be recycled pretty easily.
Interesting. And what about hydrogen fuel cells? Aren't they supposed to be really clean?
They produce only water as a byproduct. But the challenge is producing hydrogen sustainably. Most methods still rely on fossil fuels.
So it kind of defeats the purpose.
Yeah, researchers are working on green hydrogen production using renewable energy sources, but that's still in development.
So I've got biofuels, air-powered cars, hydrogen fuel cells, all these cool possibilities on the horizon. But what about harnessing nature's power directly, like solar and wind?
Ah, yes, renewable energy. That's where things get really exciting. Raynham devotes a whole chapter to solar power, from small-scale solar cookers to massive solar farms.
It's amazing how much energy the sun provides.
It really is.
Why aren't we using it even more?
Well, cost has been a factor in the past, but solar technology is becoming more and more affordable, and the efficiency is improving all the time.
What about wind power? Those giant turbines are popping up everywhere.
Yeah, wind power is another area that's growing rapidly. There are massive offshore wind farms powering hundreds of thousands of homes.
And we're seeing more and more wind turbines integrated into buildings now, too.
Right? Even in urban areas. And there's some really cool concepts being developed, like airborne wind turbines tethered to the ground. They can capture the stronger winds at higher altitudes.
Wow. So it's not just about those giant turbines anymore.
Nope. There's a lot of innovation happening.
It's amazing how we're finding all these new ways to tap into natural energy.
It is. And it's not just wind and solar either. Raynham also talks about hydroelectric power wave energy and geothermal energy.
It's like we're finally waking up to all the possibilities around us. But this is where things get a little futuristic. What about harnessing energy from people?
Yeah, that's a pretty wild concept. Raynham talks about things like play pumps in Malawi. They use children's energy to pump water.
Really?
Yeah, and there are devices that can capture energy from our movements, and even technologies that harvest body heat.
That's incredible.
It makes you wonder how much energy we're generating without even realizing it.
Right, it's like we're all walking power plants.
In a way, we are.
And speaking of pushing boundaries, what about nanotechnology? I know it has something to do with really small things.
It does. It's all about manipulating matter at the atomic level.
So it's pretty complex stuff.
It can be, but it has huge potential. Raynham talks about nanogenerators powered by light movement or even body heat.
Wow, so like clothes that generate electricity.
Exactly, or solar cells so tiny they can be embedded into almost anything.
That's mind-blowing.
It is, and these are real technologies being developed right now.
So we've covered energy sources on land, in the water, and even from ourselves, but now Raynham takes us to space.
Space.
Yeah, he talks about space-based solar power stations.
Wow, that sounds like something out of a science fiction movie.
It does, but it's a real concept.
So we're talking about solar panels in orbit beaming energy back to Earth.
Exactly.
It's a bold idea.
It is, and there are definitely challenges to overcome.
Like, how do we get all that equipment up there?
Yeah.
And how do we maintain it?
Right, but the potential benefits are huge. Imagine uninterrupted sunlight bypassing the limitations of our atmosphere.
That would be a game changer. And space-based solar power is just one example. Raynham also mentions things like ion engines, solar sails, and lunar energy systems.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. From everyday energy-saving tips to space-based power stations, it seems like the future of energy is full of exciting possibilities.
It definitely is.
But what's the overall message here? What's Raynham trying to tell us?
One of the big themes I see is this idea of thinking globally but acting locally. He talks about shifting away from centralized power generation and moving towards more distributed energy systems.
So instead of those massive power plants, we'd have smaller, more localized sources.
Exactly. Things like rooftop solar panels, community wind farms, geothermal.
That would make the system more resilient, right? If one part goes down, it doesn't affect the whole thing.
Precisely. It's a more decentralized and adaptable approach. Raynham even suggests that homes could become mini power stations, generating their own energy and selling excess back to the grid.
Wow, so it's like turning consumers into producers.
The way it is.
And that ties into another concept he talks about, local manufacturing using 3D printing and something called biofabrication.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating stuff.
Can you explain biofabrication in simpler terms?
It's kind of like taking inspiration from nature's manufacturing processes. Think about how a tree grows from a seed. Following a specific blueprint, biofabrication aims to do the same thing, to create products using biomaterials.
So it's not just 3D printing with plant-based plastics.
It's more than that. It's about growing products from the ground up.
That sounds amazing, but wouldn't those processes still require energy?
They would, but that's where the distributed energy system comes in. If homes and communities are generating their own renewable energy, they can power these new forms of manufacturing sustainably.
So it's all connected?
It is. It's about creating a more localized and self-sufficient system.
That's a pretty big shift from our current model.
It is. It would require a lot of changes.
But the potential benefits are pretty incredible. Less pollution, less waste, a more resilient and equitable distribution of resources.
And Rainham believes it's not just possible, but essential for a sustainable future.
But wouldn't there be resistance to such a radical change?
Oh, there definitely would be. The industries that benefit from the current system wouldn't give up easily.
So how realistic is this vision of a distributed energy future?
Rainham argues that change often starts from the bottom up. Grassroots movements, consumer pressure, technological advancements. These things can drive change even in the face of opposition.
So like a wave building momentum.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that change doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process.
But even small steps can make a difference.
They can. They really can.
It seems like we need a combination of things to make this transition happen. Individual action, technological innovation, policy changes.
I agree. It's a multi-pronged approach.
And that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive.
Sounds good. Picking up where we left off with this idea of thinking globally, acting locally when it comes to energy.
Yeah, that was a pretty mind-blowing concept, like really rethinking how we produce and consume energy.
It is. And Rainham actually uses the 1973 oil crisis as a good example. You know, when countries suddenly realized how dependent they were on energy from faraway places?
Oh, yeah, that was a huge wake-up call, wasn't it?
It really exposed the fragility of that centralized system.
Yeah, it's like putting all your eggs in one basket, and then the basket breaks.
Exactly. And that's what a distributed energy system tries to avoid.
So how would that actually work? Like in practice?
Well, instead of relying on those massive power plants, imagine a network of smaller, more localized sources.
Okay, so like rooftop solar panels on people's houses.
Exactly. Things like that. Community wind farms, even harnessing energy from geothermal sources.
And so if one part of the system goes down, it doesn't cause a blackout for a whole region.
Right. It makes the grid much more resilient and adaptable.
That's pretty cool.
And Rainham even suggests that individual homes could become like mini power stations.
So they could generate their own energy and even sell excess back to the grid.
Exactly. It's a pretty empowering idea.
Yeah, it is. It's like giving people more control over their energy use.
And it ties into another concept. He talks about local manufacturing using 3D printing and biofabrication.
Yeah, biofabrication. That one still sounds a bit like science fiction to me.
I know it's a pretty futuristic concept.
Yeah.
But it's essentially about taking inspiration from nature's manufacturing processes.
So like how a tree grows from a seed.
Exactly. Nature is incredibly efficient at creating complex structures, using minimal resources and energy. Biofabrication is about applying those same principles to create the things we need.
So instead of mass production in giant factories, we could grow products locally.
That's the idea. It's still early stages, but the potential is huge.
But those processes would still require energy, right?
Of course, but that's where the distributed energy system comes in. If homes and communities are generating their own renewable energy, they can power those processes sustainably.
It's all starting to connect now.
It is. It's about creating a more localized and interconnected system.
So it's not just about energy, it's about rethinking our whole way of life.
It is. It's a pretty radical shift.
But are there actually any real-world examples of this happening?
There are. It's still early days. But Rainham mentions a number of communities experimenting with these concepts. Things like eco-villages using renewable energy and permaculture principles, cities exploring microgrids and localized food production, and companies developing innovative bio-based materials.
So it's not just a theoretical idea, it's actually happening.
It is. It's happening in pockets all over the world.
But wouldn't there be pushback from, like, big industries? The ones that benefit from the current system?
Oh, absolutely. There would be huge resistance from those vested interests.
I mean, fossil fuel companies, for example.
Yeah, they're not going to give up their profits easily.
So how do we overcome that?
Rainham argues that change often starts from the bottom up. Grassroots movements, consumer pressure, technological advancements. These things can create a wave of change that even powerful industries can't ignore.
So it's about people demanding a different way of doing things.
Exactly. It's about shifting the power dynamic.
That's a powerful idea.
It is. And it's important to remember that change doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process with lots of ups and downs.
But even small actions can contribute to that larger movement.
They can even just talking about these issues, raising awareness, making conscious choices. All of that adds up.
It seems like we need a combination of individual action and systemic change.
We do. We need people making changes in their own lives. And we need policies that support and encourage the transition to a more sustainable future.
So it's about personal responsibility and collective action.
It is. We all have a role to play.
So as we move into the final part of our deep dive, what are some specific actions people can take?
That's a great question, and we'll explore some of those in the next part of our conversation.
Okay, so we've talked about the problems and we've brainstormed some pretty cool solutions, but how do we actually get there? Like, how do we bridge that gap between where we are and that more sustainable future?
Yeah, well, it's not about waiting for like one magic solution, right? It's going to take a multifaceted approach.
Yeah. Right. Rainham really emphasizes that. Like, we need to change the entire system.
Yeah, it's about thinking about energy and manufacturing and how we design our communities, all in a more integrated way.
You mentioned earlier that even individual actions can make a difference. What are some specific things people can do, like right now?
Well, first off, take a look at your own energy use at home. Are there areas where you can cut back?
Yeah, like switching to energy-efficient appliances.
Exactly. Or you could look into things like rooftop solar.
It's amazing how much energy we waste without even realizing it.
It really is. So just being more mindful of your habits can have a big impact.
And then there's supporting businesses that are committed to sustainability, right?
Absolutely. Like choosing to buy from companies that are using renewable energy.
It's like voting with your dollars.
Exactly. And then there's getting involved in your community.
Like joining local groups or organizations that are working on energy-related issues.
Right. Or volunteering your time or donating to support their efforts.
There's power in collective action.
There is. And don't forget about contacting your elected officials. Let them know you care about these issues.
Right, like supporting policies that promote renewable energy.
Exactly. It's about making your voice heard.
And Rainham also talks about being open to new ideas.
Yeah, don't be afraid to think outside the box. What might seem crazy today could be commonplace tomorrow.
Like smartphones. I mean, nobody had those 20 years ago.
Exactly. Things can change really fast.
Especially when technology and public demand come together.
I think that's a key point.
Yeah.
The future isn't set in stone. We're creating it with every choice we make.
What I find really interesting is that Rainham doesn't frame this transition as a sacrifice. It's more like an opportunity.
Right. He paints a picture of a future that's actually more abundant and fulfilling.
Like communities that are more self-reliant and resilient.
Exactly. And cities that are cleaner and quieter and more livable.
It makes it feel less like a burden and more like something to strive for.
It is. It's about reclaiming our agency and realizing that we have the power to shape our future.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the future of energy, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away?
I think it's a call to action. We're not just passengers on this ride. We're the drivers.
We have the power to make a difference.
We do, both individually and collectively.
It's about recognizing that our choices matter.
And that together we can create a future where energy is a force for good.
Well said. And that concludes our deep dive into the future of energy. We hope you found it informative, inspiring, and most importantly, empowering. Until next time, keep those brain cells buzzing.